Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I guess for a quick introduction, we can start with names, fund, and what vertical we're most interested in this conference.
Okay, I'm Dougie. I'm from Figment Capital, and I think I'm just interested in general about actually making crypto useful and not just a big casino. So, yeah.
Never gonna happen. Mass, I'm a research partner at Maven 11. What I'm most interested in, probably applications utilizing infrastructure to build better applications. So not just smart contract applications.
Hey everyone, I'm Yuan. I'm a partner at Blockchain Capital. Similar to Dougie, but maybe a little different. I'm mostly interested in things that can get adoption, casino or not.
So, and my name's Gurnoor from Placeholder. I think what I'm most interested in is seeing if we're iterating marginally on what we've already built or if there's something net new that's happening this time around. So that's exciting. But to kick it off, main focus points will be on interop today and future directions that it's taking. So to start us off, just curious as to what interop approaches y'all have seen specifically amongst L2s and what y'all are most excited about or optimistic about.
I can go first. I think there's been a lot of talk earlier today as well on intent specifically, especially in the context of like assets. Obviously, it goes a little bit broader than this when you're talking about like state interoperability and not just like moving assets around. I think the solver intent model has solved a lot of the waiting game that you used to have to like move assets to a specific rollup, and they'll take the risk of that. So that's been one of the more sort of interesting things that's happened in terms of volume. Obviously, I think what Polymer is doing with the Prove API is super interesting from just lowering that cost of actually dealing with messaging instead of just assets.
Yeah, I think to build on top of that, like I definitely think intents and solvers and I group agents kind of into that same domain are pushing things towards more of like an intent-focused design where instead of users having to constantly think about like which chain they want to transact on, they just say like what they want to do, and a lot of the execution is actually outsourced to another third party. And I think a lot of applications are driving this. Like Moonshot is just on Solana, but think about that for any chain, and then you have like solvers going into that. Obviously, Moonshot doesn't use it, but I'm just using like a general application kind of interface example. I think people are becoming less conscious of which chain they're actually transacting on and which assets are native to which chain. They want to just say, I want to buy this, and I don't care where it is. And so naturally, that's a big forcing function towards like interoperability and figuring that out, because right now it's pretty constrained still.
I think I'll answer this a little differently. I think there's been so many interesting approaches in the interop space. Polymer, with Prove API, I think is building something that's taking the right technical approach, probably the right way the industry should be headed. You have kind of the solver approach in terms of volumes getting a lot of traction. But I think ultimately there's been so many solutions that people have put out in the last years, and everyone says their solution is the best one. And it doesn't really matter what I think, what investors think, what people think. At the end of the day, it's like, what do users use? They use applications. What are the applications picking? Right now, not much. So really, I think from my standpoint, like as I'm looking at the space, it's like, what approach can you take that makes it really easy for you to sell your product to applications? Because at the end of the day, if you can actually get distribution, then you can insert whatever. And that's going to be the solution that the applications end up using, right? And so even if, it's not like technically the best solution, if all the applications end up using you, then, you've won, right? And so I think personally, it's like thinking about what are the ways you could build your interop solution in such a way where it's very easy for you to sell into applications with actual users that are driving volume.
Do you think that interop has become more B2B instead of like B2C?
I think we're increasingly going to move in that direction, yes.
Yeah, and I guess one aspect of that also is if you look at like the way people bridge today is in the of assets, it's always like an aggregator. So whatever underlying thing on that aggregator that it's connected to, that is the cheapest and the fastest, it's going to win out in terms of getting users. So you don't really have to go to the end user. You're just going to like an aggregator plugging, and then whatever aspect of that aggregator has the lowest cost is going to be picked for that specific route.
Exactly, right? And if you're like a new user to crypto this cycle, you probably came in by trading meme coins on Phantom, right? Phantom, what have they integrated? They have their own aggregator they built in-house. Of course, that's just on Solana. but they're using other aggregators to enable the users to go other chains, right? And then as we get more and more companies, people like Robinhood, who have large user bases and existing distribution channels, if they were to enter into crypto, like, what are they going to use? Like, it feels like the companies that are best positioned from a B2B perspective are going to end up winning those clients. And if they actually onboard a lot of their users, then, you know, the interop space today could just look radically different, because suddenly you have 10 million users using something that were not using anything before.
Yeah, I think on the efficiency point, like when you're now outsourcing execution to third parties, whether it's like solvers or agents, like that literally is the only thing that matters. Like a lot of people today who are manually bridging, they might just use name your bridge because that's what they've used before. But solvers and agents are way more incentivized for the pick the most efficient route. And so naturally that's like a forcing function again towards like just hyper efficient bridging essentially.
Well, we've seen this like trend of, all right, we have values of decentralization or whatever. Those are usually sacrificed for performance, for execution speed, for UI UX purposes, and then we start the process back. I think we're kind of seeing the same thing with solvers too. Like the entire mechanism is dependent on a few central points of failure. Although they're exciting, do you all think that decentralization in any of those marketplaces is important, or the way it's working right now with a couple and then, you know, maybe more official market makers coming into the space is okay or acceptable?
I mean, the obvious answer is yes, it matters to like a very small section of people. And I would hope those people are in power to make it as efficient as possible. But I think if you ask, when I go to bridge from Solana to Base or whatever, I'm probably not looking at specifically what solver or what underlying tech is being used. I'm just trying to get from here to here as fast as I humanly possibly can. And I've seen people sort of present in a UX, like, a security score, like 3 out of 5. Like, do I care about the 3 out of 5, or do I want to pick the 4 out of 5? I don't know if people are making a decision based on that.
Yeah, I don't think people end up really caring much either. They want to make sure their funds are safe and they're going to get the most efficient outcome. I think the way that decentralization could take place is like if we do see a massive proliferation of rollups, like it then becomes a lot more difficult for a single solver or market maker to actually service all of them. So you could see specialization and therefore like decentralization kind of emerge. But if we maintain in today's status quo where we have like a handful of rollups that people use, that is going to be less decentralized, and like inventory management's much easier in that situation. So I think like it really depends on where rollups go long term, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it probably matters until it doesn't, right? People care when something happens to them, and they realize, okay, this matters. I think if you look at like a lot of the very big funds in the US, for example, I don't think they're comfortable putting like $5 billion on Sonic, but I think they're comfortable putting $5 billion on Ethereum. So in that sense, I think it depends on where in the food chain you are, if you care or not.
Well, this concept of like L1 alignment, I guess, as well, has come up a lot with being based or being aligned with your L1, as compared to favoring flexibility with an app chain or your own custom rollup. Now, there's trade-offs of both, right? With based rollups, yes, you're giving up a lot, but interop becomes much, much easier. On the app chain side, you gain flexibility, but you're having to work on interop workarounds. Are there any opinions as to what y'all prefer? Nationalizing your rollup onto the L1 and making it completely aligned, or giving people programmable rules but then offering them complex interop workarounds?
So I'll answer this question and your previous question in one go. I think the right decision to make here is you pick whatever path gives you the strongest go-to-market advantage possible, right? Because sure, you could go to the full logical extreme of be centralized, ship fast, but we've had examples of that not working because you have a shitty bridge and it gets hacked, right? There's been chains that kind of took it to the logical extreme and the chain broke because they forget, didn't understand it, put on hardware, clocked it to the max speed, and then the users couldn't use it, indexers couldn't index it, right? And so like, what are the minimum steps you have to take where, you know, from like a decentralization perspective, from all these other technical considerations perspective, to get to market quickly and position yourselves sufficiently, you know, in a sufficiently differentiated way from your competitors where you can go to market really well and really quickly and, you know, leverage that to get users. Because at the end of the day, if you have the best, most decentralized solution with the best tech, it doesn't matter if no one uses you, right? And so like, can you use your positioning relative to the technology that's available to you to gain users? And then after that, once you have users, you know, feel free to go to the most technically elegant thing, right? But like, if going to the most technically elegant thing before you have any users doesn't help you get any users, then at the end of the day, you might have the, the best thing, but no one uses you, so who cares?
Hyperliquid.
I was about to use that example for, well, okay, so going back to the base rollup question, I think it depends on your product. And to use the Hyperliquid example, I think if you're like a perp exchange where like synchronous composability doesn't matter as much, I just deposit USDC and I go long Bitcoin 50x, then that is fine, right? And I can get way more customization, so I can do cancel prioritization, which Hyperliquid does. I could implement some EIPs that is going to make the life easier for the users, maybe with a different type of wallet setup. But then maybe I'm some kind of applications that has to like utilize Aave, or I have to make calls into the Uniswap router. And if I don't have synchronous composability, like that's going to become a lot harder to do. So I think there's some applications, specifically DeFi Legos, that want that base composability. While if you are an app like a Hyperliquid, then you don't really care as much about this. But it does give you way more flexibility, which, as we've seen, have created a way better application to utilize.
Yeah, I have the same answer. I think the only thing I'd add is I think like a chain like Solana is better suited for base rollups than Ethereum. It's just much faster, and therefore the issues that you mentioned with base rollups are massively decreased. So I would rather see base rollups there than on Ethereum.
And so we've seen, a lot of folks have talked about growing number of app chains, growing number of flexible options for individual apps. And then you also have your other camp that's saying, all right, the base layers or all of these rollups will continue to consolidate as only a few breakout apps find product market fit. And so this is kind of a devil's advocate type question, but how much does interop actually even matter then if folks are staying on a certain app because they have a certain trust within the app, or that's where their liquidity is located, or furthermore, if they're staying in a certain ecosystem which is pretty composable within that one space?
So I think even in a world where people just use one app and they don't, like the app doesn't straddle chains, it's just on one chain, I think interop still really matters, because let's say you're like a noob crypto user and you want to go try out this app chain called Hyperliquid. You don't even know it's on an app chain. You just hear about Hyperliquid and you want to go and put your money there and start trading. Now, how do you get your money from, I don't know, some random chain you're on because you onboarded through Privy to like mint some NFT on some random chain, and then now you have like $100. How do you get that from that chain, like chain N+2 to Hyperliquid? You don't know. You need interop to do that, right? And like to get from chain N+2 to Hyperliquid efficiently, like how does the routing look, right? Maybe it's another rollup, maybe it's not, maybe it's its own L1. You as a user shouldn't have to figure that out, right? The application, like in this case Hyperliquid, should make it very easy for you to move your money from chain N+2, your $100 onto Hyperliquid to start trading, right? And that mechanism of onboarding, if you're an application on an app chain, like that requires interop, right? That requires solver integrations, aggregation across a bunch of different bridges, a bunch of DEXs, all to ensure that when your user comes to you and wants to use your chain, they don't churn because they don't know how crypto works. They don't know, what bridges are. They don't know what like the highest volume bridge is, right? That's going to give them the best return, right? And so from that standpoint, interop will always matter, so long as you have more than one chain, and even with app chains, it's going to matter a lot.
Yeah, I actually think that's an amazing answer. I think interop is important as a means of customer acquisition, and it should actually be the application's huge priority to make it as easily accessible as possible to users. And so whether that's an off-ramp or bridging in funds that already are on-chain, it's the application's job to make that super easy, because it does lead to actual adoption.
Wouldn't I want to silo them off so they don't leave?
I mean, yeah, ideal thing would be one-way interop, but like that's also not, no one's going to want to opt in and move size into something they can't get out of. So I don't think that actually makes sense.
Well, the motivation for the question was, you have these large ecosystems and then you have smaller, medium-sized ecosystems, right? And the logic is that, all right, you'll consolidate to these larger ones. And so it seems that interop's kind of a one-way bridge where medium-ish sized ecosystems benefit more from partnering with these larger ones, as do the other way. It doesn't feel symbiotic.
No, I think what we've seen, I think Arjun earlier as well in his talk also kind of, came across this point, is that we have so many standards, and I'm obviously going to gravitate towards a standard that has the most amount of similar types of applications that I want to interact with. So like Superchain. If I'm building anything that's any kind of relation to Coinbase or anything on Coin or Optimism, I'm just going to go pick and build my app rollup on the Superchain, because I want that interoperability. that just sort of exists seamlessly in that ecosystem. So it's probably going to congregate. And I think we're seeing that congregation as well. I still think it's probably, as an application, still an evolution. I think you start maybe as a smart contract, and then you start getting some kind of PMF. Then you move into maybe an app rollup, maybe a base rollup, one or the other. And then you realize, you complete control, and you move over to an app chain. And that might be completely outside of those ecosystems. But those are only like very much breakout applications. And we don't have many of those. Hyperliquid.
I think the one thing I'd say is like the only time I use bridges today, to be honest, are between Solana and Hyperliquid, and like it's actually in both of their best interests to make that process as easy as possible. Because like in my opinion, there's no perp stacks on Solana that's as good as Hyperliquid, and so if I want to go like leverage long something, I'm gonna go to Hyperliquid. But if I want to trade some like fair launch token or a shitcoin, like I'm gonna go to Solana. And so like they actually shouldn't be as PvP, maybe because Hyperliquid L1 now, different story. But like I kind of think you still want to have that easy access in between both points, because you would have my money going back and forth, whereas today I'm like, I don't really feel like bridging, and so I'm just going to leave it on Hyperliquid and use different money on Solana.
Is there any interest in rollup stacks on alternative VMs? We've talked a lot about Ethereum and how it's kind of embraced the L2 landscape. Others are more high-performance ecosystems, and so any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a natural progression. I think most of the applications on the alt VM, like generalized chains, a lot of the apps haven't realized they need a rollup, for example, maybe because they haven't realized they need to make some ordering changes, could be the cancels, as mentioned earlier. I think, at least that's my thesis, and the fund's thesis as well, is that's going to happen. So you are going to see base rollups on Solana, something like a magic block. There's soon others as well. And I'm sure that's the same is happening on move-based chains as well. So I think a lot of those applications, they'll find PMF. For example, like Pump.Fun. If Pump.Fun was a base rollup on Solana, and they could control the ordering specifically for their own AMM, the amount of money they would have made, they already made like 600 million, but they would have made billions instead. So I think people will realize that and start to build applications that can take advantage of that.
Yeah, it's like once the cost of like actually doing that goes down in terms of like user experience and whatnot, like you have full incentive to do that. Like the Pump.Fun example is a great one, but like would Pump have gotten there had they just launched the base rollup out of the gate? Like no chance. And so it's like it is a graduation thing, but also like once the infra is better to do that, like the level you have to hit to do that becomes much lower, and you just see more apps actually tend towards that over time. But I think, yeah, like the VM side, like I do think we'll see VM experimentation. I think like object-based like VMs like Move are actually very powerful and can enable things that can't exist in the EVM right now, for example. And so I think like when you see things you can't do in an EVM and you can instead do it on Move, and let's say you don't have to sacrifice now being on a different rollup, like that is kind of appealing. And so I think we could see that naturally take place, yeah.
I think that, like, to Dougie's point, right? Like, I think that's like the crux of it, right? Like, does your alt VM actually enable a differentiated application to be built? Like, sure, it might be a different VM, but if it actually doesn't enable anything unique that was not possible before, then it's like really hard for you to stand out, right? Like, everyone's launching a new chain every day. So if you want to, as a new rollup, actually have applications in your ecosystem that are differentiated, you must have something where, you know, your alt VM enables something where they literally couldn't do it anywhere before, right? And to the extent that you have that, then I think you might have something very interesting.
Yeah, I think like selling points is a lot easier on Move than it is on EVM. Like, if you're collecting points you want to sell on EVM, you literally have to give up your wallet or like form sub wallets. On Move, it's just an object, and you can just set it to a new, like you can actually use AMM for it.
I think the conclusion from all of this refers back to a previous panel, which was instead of debating different interop standards, there's ways that they can be layered and work for different purposes with the intent that user actions are fulfilled as fast as possible. And we've talked a lot about agentic behavior as well on chain and how all of that's abstracted away from the user. And so I think performance and speed becomes priority number one when it comes to interacting across different ecosystems.
And hopefully security as well.
Yeah.
I think it's only fitting to end it with Hyperliquid. All right. Cool. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.